Well, dear listeners, today I bring into this gathering a woman whose name has traveled through generations under the weight of judgment, a figure so deeply lodged in the afterlife of fairy tale that many ears receive her with a ready-made image already formed, yet she comes before us now by another road, carrying the keys of the house, the memory of rank, the pressure of want, and the grave intelligence that settles upon any life shaped by duty, fear, and the management of other people's futures. Here I would begin, inside the house itself, where stories take on weight through bread, linen, inheritance, fatigue, ceremony, and the long discipline of keeping appearances upright while the beams strain overhead. A podcast creates its own chamber for such a subject. The voice enters close to the ear. It carries cadence, emphasis, breath, and pause. Through that nearness, an old tale recovers some of the seriousness that familiarity has worn smooth. Cinderella moves through culture in symbols polished by repetition until the inner pressures of the household grow faint beneath their shine. The slipper gleams, the coach flashes, the ashes darken the girl just enough to prepare a later splendor. Meanwhile, the woman who governs the house arrives in public memory as a hardened shape, fixed in advance, bearing centuries of moral suspicion in her posture and tone. This evening I ask for another kind of hearing. I ask that listeners allow the old figure to approach at human scale, with the sounds of doors, accounts, daughters, disappointments, and social hazards moving around her. Rachel Hochhauser Lady Tremaine makes such hearing possible, though the significance of that movement reaches beyond literary novelty or the seasonal excitement gathers around a much-discussed new novel. Whenever a tale so deeply lodged in collective memory opens from the side of the woman appointed to carry its hardness, an interpretive disturbance begins. Long-settled judgments loosen their hold. Pity spreads into wider rooms. The domestic interior, once treated as background furnishing, opens like an archive in which labor, maternal strategy, class anxiety, widowhood, and female endurance leave their marks upon every surface. That is the door through which I invite listeners to enter. My concern rests with a more demanding inquiry. What kind of knowledge has been stored inside the figure of the stepmother? What moral labor has that figure performed for the tale, and for the culture that kept telling it? What forms of female force had to be cast into shadow so that sweetness might appear serene, beauty might seem self-justifying, and assent might retain the air of miracle? Those questions give the lecture its pressure. Through them, the old story begins to sound different in the ear, and the house at its center begins to speak with a voice older, harsher, and truer than the nursery usually allows. The clearest repair came through removing every negative construction and turning each sentence toward presence, pressure, and active consequence. What passes for wickedness when a woman gathers the fragments of a household in her apron, counts the cost of bread, measures the hazard of marriage, then speaks with the hard edge that comfort teaches men to condemn? Rachel Hochhauser Lady Tremaine, a debut novel published on March 3, 2026 by St. Martin's Press, entered the spring season, already marked out as a major reimagining of Cinderella, carried by Reese's Book Club, strengthened by starred notices, then folded into the wider machinery of anticipated fiction lists. That public consecration holds genuine interpretive importance, inasmuch as it discloses the literary risk the book assumes before the reader crosses the threshold of the first page. A woman long confined to the tale's margin steps forward into narrative sovereignty and takes possession of the moral atmosphere once reserved for Innocence, whereby the fairy tale ceases to present itself chiefly as a pageant of virtue under pressure and instead opens into a harder meditation upon labor, motherhood, rank, appetite, inheritance, female endurance, and the cost exacted by tenderness within the house. Once the so-called villain receives the tale's central gravity, judgment itself alters in pressure, reach, structure, and moral consequence. Hochhauser's own para texts announce that transfer with unusual clarity. Macmillan presents the novel as Cinderella seen through the eyes of the evil stepmother, then identifies its animating principle in the stark phrase, "The length a mother will go for her children," while Reese's Book Club frames the same imaginative shift through the associated pressures of motherhood, family, perfection, and social strain. Publishers Weekly adds emphasis upon medieval texture, maternal instinct, and female strength, whereas Entertainment Weekly's early excerpt yields something more valuable than publicity shorthand by granting access to the grain of the narrative voice itself. A woman twice widowed, lodged in a decaying manor, burdened by daughters, stepdaughter, hawk, memory, class fear, bodily recollection, and a sexual knowledge acquired through bruising experience. Under that accumulation of detail, the novel begins to appear as something sterner than a fashionable reversal in which villainy is polished into grievance or malice dissolved into sentiment. Hochhauser instead compels the reader to inhabit the economy of the woman whom the inherited tale had trained generations to despise, thereby furnishing villainy with a ledger, a kitchen, a body, a field, and a genealogy of hurt. Fairy tale memory usually advances through compressed emblems whose brightness obscures the density of the tradition that produced them. The slipper, the ashes, the ball, the coach, the sisters, the stepmother standing almost as weather over the heroine's ascent. Yet Cinderella has always lived through plurality rather than singularity, and the familiar English current passes first through Perrault's Cinderella of 1697, where grace, polished charm, godmotherly favour, and courtly assent gather around the heroine as the very image of rewarded gentility, then through Grimm's Aschenputtel, where the girl remains bound to her mother's grave, to the hazel tree, to birds, to grave soil piety, and to a harsher domestic order whose cruelty carries a more severe moral grain. When Hochhauser returns to Lady Tremaine, she enters a tale already crowded with transfer adaptation, religious tincture, class fantasy, and domestic terror. Her freedom proceeds through that plurality, while her seriousness emerges through the refusal to pretend that multiplicity itself somehow purifies the tale of its older violences. Perrault's moral already reveals the social world that fashioned it. For beauty there attracts admiration, graciousness secures affection, and supernatural sponsorship oils the passage into rank, so that one hears behind the fable the speech music of the salon and sees within the magic the education of girls into pleasing force. Grimm offers a different liturgy altogether, one in which grave memory governs aid, household hierarchy hardens into daily labour, and violence takes on the grain of domestic routine, so that the mother remains active after burial, while the stepmother becomes the custodian of scarcity through humiliation, exclusion, and social rivalry. Between those poles the stepmother gathers into herself a cluster of civilizational fears concerning second wives, blended households, maternal substitution, inheritance conflict, and female authority, released from the sentimental image of softness. And the significance of Hochhauser's novel lies precisely in its recognition that this figure had always carried more history than the nursery admitted. Within older tale logic, the stepmother serves as an instrument of purification, bearing the household aggression that narrative systems often hesitate to place either upon the father or upon the dead mother, then carrying the stain through which maternity in the abstract may continue to gleam. Marina Warner's work on fairy tale returns repeatedly to this displacement, showing how the maternal field divides between a sanctified mother elsewhere and a punitive female governor within the house. The same structure appears in Maria Totter's readings of Grimm, where domestic tales preserve severe conflicts beneath the veil of wonder, thereby revealing how family violence survives in symbolic form even when softened by magic. From that angle, the stepmother functions less as an individual aberration than as a technology of narrative hygiene, absorbing female rage, property anxiety, erotic rivalry, class aspiration, fear of age, and fear of reproductive succession, so that one woman may bear the contamination required for motherhood in the abstract to remain ceremonially intact. Hochhauser enters that old arrangement with the clear intention of cutting it open in order to examine what historical sediment had settled there through centuries of retelling. The sharpest alteration appears to my mind in the category of motive. The nursery version teaches that Lady Tremaine seeks elevation for her daughters through vanity, malice, and envy, categories that preserve moral neatness precisely through their distance from lived social pressure. Hochhauser's public synopsis, by contrast, replaces that abstract moral shorthand with debt, widowhood, precarious status, decaying property, fragile marriage prospects, and a female existence exposed within a social order where respectability operates as currency, while the Entertainment Weekly excerpt deepens the matter by granting Etheldreda a girlhood among men, tools, brewery work, and practical labour before ushering her into the later schooling of manners designed for marriage. That sequence alters the moral temperature of the whole tale, for the future stepmother emerges from a world of making, repair, observation, and bodily competence only to enter another in which feminine survival travels through performance, alliance, fertility, and decorum. Within such a structure, maternal ambition on behalf of daughters begins to resemble force directed toward survival long before it resembles vice, and the reader is compelled to entertain the difficult proposition that the woman called villain may simply understand the social order with greater truthfulness than the girl called heroine, That shift moves the tale's moral center from innocence toward knowledge. Cinderella usually triumphs through recognized virtue, yet Hochhauser's Lady Tremaine appears to move through a harsher education in which virtue alone seldom feeds children. Rank seldom protects a widow unless she bargains well, and marriage presents itself in public as sacrament while operating in daily life as contract and transaction. Publishers Weekly notes that Hochhauser grounded the tale in bleak financial pressure, and the author herself has described the novel's germ through a season of caregiving strain, pregnancy, emergency surgery, child-rearing, and exhausted duty. Such biography enters the lecture in a very limited manner, serving neither as sentimental key nor as causal reduction, and instead offering evidence for the conditions that brought the stepmother into view under the sign of labor instead of spectacle, a writer marked by strain discerned in that figure a life formed by hardship, and from that act of discernment emerged a fiction whose sympathy grows through economic realism and resists the easy consolations of absolution. The shift of that order carries theological force, for fairy tale has always trafficked in judgment, blessing, trial, reward, and punishment with a near liturgical simplicity that gives its moral architecture the appearance of inevitability. Once the stepmother speaks, that simplicity yields under strain, and the household ceases to resemble a courtroom in which innocence waits serenely for vindication. In its place, there emerges a contested domestic field where competing claims attach themselves to bodies, appetites, histories, kinship obligation, and the positive law of social survival. The inherited tale rations pity with severe economy, directing it overwhelmingly toward the ash-girl, whereas Hochhauser appears to ask whether pity has for too long been distributed along lines too narrow for the actual pressures of female life. When Lady Tremaine becomes legible as mother, widow, manager of decline, and strategist under patriarchy, pity leaves its single bed and spreads across the entire house, with the result that moral attention itself grows heavier, harder, and more exacting. A further transformation appears in the treatment of power. Traditional Cinderella, at least in its most popular afterlives, flatters passivity by allowing the heroine to endure, remain sweet, receive aid, then rise. Critics have for decades worried over that structure as a pedagogy of compliance dressed in glitter, and Jack Zips gives one of the clearest accounts of the mechanism by reading fairy tale as a form of cultural instruction. Hochhauser's interviews place direct pressure upon the older lesson that beauty joined to niceness may secure selection by a prince, whereas the novel, on present evidence, refuses to treat rescue as an adequate moral horizon. Lady Tremaine seeks outcomes, calculates risks, chooses under constraint, and enters the field of action with a degree of agency that resists sentimental containment. Even a resistant reader must concede that the tale thereby shifts away from fantasies of rescue toward the drama of female exertion under duress, so that Villainy begins to look less like an essence than like the historical name awarded to women whose agency disrupts the sanctioned distribution of virtue. Agency, however, carries its own peril, and the lecture would grow thin were Lady Tremaine merely recast as a covert saint. Hochhauser's materials point toward a figure far harder than that, for the Entertainment Weekly excerpt preserves hardness, cruelty, and memory marked by pain. Rees's framing keeps before us the pressure of perfection, and the Orion synopsis introduces a sordid court secret, a crumbling manor, the wrong girl receiving the prize, and a choice between social security and a stepdaughter whose conduct has offered scant cause for tenderness. Under such conditions, the novel's seriousness lies in its willingness to defend the stepmother's humanity without laundering her conduct into innocence, for a moral center need not coincide with moral purity. Many of the strongest modern retellings discover their center where cost becomes visible, and Lady Tremaine appears to inherit that center by carrying the full burden of cost before the reader's eyes. The transfer of moral centrality also alters the tale's sense of time. Cinderella traditionally races toward recognition, yet Hochhauser's premise appears to slow the clock until years begin to bear interpretive weight. Widowhood unfolds across duration, debt accrues season by season, daughters ripen toward the marriage market, houses decay board by board, reputation gathers or rots through repeated social contact, and bodily memory stores old injury with a patience more durable than plot. Under that temporal thickening, caricature loses some of its power, for caricature thrives in foreshortened time, while complexity emerges once attrition acquires years consequences, and recurrence. A woman's harshness, after decades of narrowing prospects, carries a different ethical demand from the theatrical cackle of a stock villain in a single scene, and the novel appears keenly aware that duration itself may function as explanatory evidence even where it never rises into full exculpation. The relation between motherhood and force now comes fully into view. Popular discourse has often wrapped maternal feeling in the language of tenderness, patience, self-erasure, and sanctity, yet Christina Bacalega's account of revision as a mode of exposing narrative strategy helps to sharpen what Hochhauser is doing with that older ideal. Force here names direction, pressure, expenditure, collision, and the kind of hardened practical energy through which a woman in conditions of patriarchal scarcity may become organizer, broker, watcher, manipulator, keeper of rationed affection, and guardian of futures that social order threatens to close. From the child's angle, such a figure will often appear severe. From the angle of ideology, she may appear monstrous precisely where ideology requires women to embody care through softness alone. Lady Tremaine thus tests a grave proposition, namely that maternal love may arrive carrying iron in its hem, and that such iron may bruise in one moment, even while it preserves in another. The fairy tale Stepmother also carries an additional symbolic burden tied to age. Cinderella narratives elevate youth, beauty, marriageability, and reproductive promise, whereas the older woman stands at the edge of that radiance charged with managing her own diminishment within a system that values her chiefly through daughters, dowries, alliances, sexual history, and household order. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober provide a broader literary account of the way patriarchal narrative repeatedly deposits monstrosity in older women, so that younger femininity may appear acceptable, luminous, and socially redeemable. Under that grammar, envy becomes a convenient shorthand for structural terror, and Hochhauser's decision to narrate from the older woman's perspective restores that terror to intelligible scale by allowing the reader to see how female value approaches expiry under the gaze of courts, men, kin, and markets. In such a setting, the ball ceases to resemble a dream and begins to resemble an auction accompanied by music. That logic also explains a good deal of the novel's present buzz. The spring audience in 2026 encounters in Lady Tremaine a retelling that feels timely through its relation to older questions returned under fresh pressure, whose labor keeps families afloat, whose cruelty receives narration, whose ambition society reads as prudence, whose ambition society condemns as corruption, and how many female lives have been flattened into moral emblems so that the culture may continue telling ceremonially clean stories about innocence. The book's appearance on anticipated release lists, its swift adoption by Reese's Book Club, and the attention it has drawn for its treatment of mother love all suggest a readership prepared to receive revision as something more than novelty. Publicity of that kind often evaporates by season's end, yet this premise touches a deeper theme, for it answers a modern hunger for revision while also addressing an older hunger for interpretive justice. At this point, the shadow of Disney deserves acknowledgement. The 1950 animated film fixed Lady Tremaine in 20th century popular memory with uncommon firmness, and Encyclopaedia Britannica's account of Cinderella's long transmission across versions and periods helps to explain how later screen embodiments could settle the public image of one branch of the tale with such authority. Through Disney, the stepmother became more than a folktale function and assumed the sharper shape of mass cultural icon, domestic elegance honed into emotional tyranny, aristocratic poise edged with calculated harm. Hochhauser therefore writes against two inheritances at once, the older folktale matrix on one side and the visual afterlife of Disney villainy on the other, and that doubleness raises the difficulty of the enterprise considerably, for a revision of Perrault alone would already matter, while a revision of Lady Tremaine as Disney made her must contend with the much denser iconography preserved through repetition, merchandising, adaptation, and shared visual memory. Yet the deepest revision lies elsewhere in the way heroism itself changes form once the villain takes the center. Heroism in Cinderella usually culminates in elevation, whereas heroism in Lady Tremaine appears more likely to culminate in discernment, sacrifice, difficult choosing, perhaps even the renunciation of the very security the protagonist had spent the book seeking to secure. The Entertainment Weekly excerpt's rendering of Ethel Dreda's interior life prepares the ground for just such a moral turn, allowing the former rival to appear, by degrees, as guardian of the heroine's future. Villainy thereby approaches the border of sanctity, though through soil far rougher than hagiography ordinarily permits, and maternal force begins to extend beyond blood into the difficult territory where care grows in the same house as resentment. Under that alteration, the tale leaves behind the old question of who deserves the prince and turns instead toward the harder inquiry into who will carry another life at genuine cost to her own. A further philosophical shift resides in the title itself. Lady Tremaine performs a subtle but decisive act of naming, for Cinderella marks the abject girl through ash, labour, hearth residue, and soiled status destined for later splendour, while Lady Tremaine grants the antagonist rank, office, burden, theatrical surface, and social equality. The title, therefore, bestows nominal dignity upon a woman previously known chiefly through her function as obstacle, and that act bears ethical weight in as much as full naming concedes inwardness. Entertainment Weekly reveals the character's full ceremonial name, Etheldreda Verity Isolde Tremaine Bramley, and under such multiplication of names caricature begins to contract for history, kinship, aspiration, accident, and class placement enter wherever mere function once stood. The soul, one might say, begins precisely where naming ceases to be schematic. Through all this there persists a central paradox. Fairy tales endure through clarity, while revisions endure through complication, and a retelling that merely muddies inherited forms will perish on the page just as surely as one that flatters the old sentimental structure with fashionable reversals. Hochhauser appears to understand that law very well, for her excerpt retains Wood's Mud Manor Ball Daughters, Parallel Memory, and female instruction, while rerouting the moral charge that once organized those elements. The result belongs, on present evidence, to that line of modern works which keep the inherited plot alive precisely by exposing the laziness of the inheritance through which it reached us. What then becomes of wickedness once a woman speaks from the centre of need rather than from the margin of caricature? The answer opened by Hochhauser's revision appears clear enough, for wickedness ceases to operate as a final category and becomes instead a contested verdict laid upon female agency when that agency disturbs the sentimental arrangement of the house. Maternal force emerges as the buried engine of actions once flattened into malice. The fairy tale reorganizes itself into a new moral geometry. Innocence loses its monopoly. Suffering distributes itself across generations of women. Labor rises into visibility. Beauty yields some part of its old sovereignty, and marriage reveals the contractual hardness long concealed beneath romance. Lady Tremaine, in inheriting the moral centre, does more than defend herself against inherited accusation. She exposes the old court of judgment as too narrow for the lives it presumed to measure, and Maria Totter's emphasis upon the hard domestic facts buried inside wonder tales supplies an exact language for that critical gain. The enchantment of the rewrite resides there, where a woman once stationed at the hearth's dark edge steps forward carrying her own light, and reveals that the old story had always burned through the labour of her hands.